At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson sat in the cockpit of his B-17G Flying Fortress, nicknamed Mispa, soaring above the skies over Budapest. The sky was a living hell, black clouds of flak exploding in violent bursts all around. At just 24 years old, Swanson had flown 17 combat missions, but experience offered no comfort now. Below, the Luftwaffe's 288mm flak guns were waiting, ready to tear any aircraft apart. Swanson's bomber was part of a 60-plane formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sturparone, Italy, tasked with striking the Shell oil refinery and railway yards in the heart of German-occupied Budapest. On paper, it was simple. In reality, survival was never guaranteed. By mid-1944, bomber crews knew the grim math. Of 10 men who climbed into a B-17, 8 wouldn't return. Some would be killed, some captured, and some would vanish without a trace. The formation pressed forward, weaving through the exploding flak. Black puffs shredded aluminum like tissue paper. Mispa took hits in the tail and wings, shrapnel punching holes through the fuselage, yet the bomber stayed in formation. Behind Swanson, his crew clung to their stations. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt sat in the co-pilot seat, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose, and Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated beside him. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft, radio operators, gunners, the flight engineer, all fully aware of the thin line between life and death. Seconds from the target, Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of high explosives fell toward the railway yards below. Mispa lurched as the weight left the aircraft. Then an 88mm shell struck the nose. The explosion was instantaneous. The front section of the bomber vaporized. Dudley, Henderson, the navigator, the plexiglass panels, even the Norden bomb sight, all gone in an instant. The aircraft pitched upward violently. With the nose gone, the center of gravity shifted backward, and the B-17 began to stall. Swanson could see sky where instruments should have been, with freezing air screaming through the open cavity. The temperature at 30,000 feet was 40 below zero. Blood from the explosion coated the flight deck, but Swanson stayed focused. The control column had vanished with the cockpit structure. Instruments were gone. Airspeed indicators, altimeters, artificial horizons, everything. All that remained were the steel control cables that ran the length of the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. Somehow, Swanson forced the nose down, somehow got the bomber level again. He rejoined loose formation with the group. No manual had ever prepared a pilot to fly a B-17 without a cockpit, and yet physics and desperation kept Mispa airborne. Behind him, the surviving crew moved forward to the bomb bay, realizing what had to be done. They could see the exposed cables whipping in the wind. If someone didn't hold them, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Semelli and Staff Sergeant Robert Bell positioned themselves near the main cable runs. There was no discussion. The task was obvious. They wrapped steel cables around their hands, pulling, adjusting, coordinating without sight of what Swanson saw ahead, without instruments, without intercoms. Every pull affected the aircraft. Too much, and it overcorrected. Too little, and nothing happened. But they did it. Mispa stayed in the air. At 9:44 a.m., another 88mm shell tore through engine number 2. Flames licked along the wing as the propeller seized. Mispa now had 3 engines, and the bomber began to fall behind the formation. Each minute over Hungary was agony. The standard procedure dictated that slow aircraft be left behind. Swanson and his crew weren't just slow, they were defying death. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Frank Menzi, along with the other crew, pulled cables relentlessly, their hands raw, cold, and bleeding. Without them, the bomber would tumble. With them, it still had a chance. Minutes stretched like hours. At 9:46, Mispa was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then two. Every movement, every breath, every pull of the steel cables was life or death. The tail structure was flexing, cracking under the stress of the missing nose, the dead engine, and the wind tearing through the fuselage. The bomber descended steadily, still heading southwest, still airborne through sheer force of will and coordination. The crew began evacuating, one by one, through waste gun openings. Each jump increased the difficulty for those still aboard. Swanson watched as his comrades disappeared into the sky over Yugoslavia, parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the landscape below. By 9:56 a.m., 5 more men had jumped, leaving only Swanson, Burnt, and one final crew member. The bomber was deteriorating. Without the crew pulling cables, it was nearly uncontrollable. Swanson and Burnt shared a silent understanding. The co-pilot had no controls left. His only rational choice was to jump. Burnt unbuckled and climbed to the waste exit, leaving Swanson alone in a 65,000-pound aircraft at 20,000 feet. The bomber was barely flying, held up by 3 engines, residual stability, and hope. Swanson waited, gauging the distance his crew would have from the crash site, knowing the longer he stayed, the better their chances. At 10 a.m., Swanson unbuckled. The wind hit him like a wall, threatening to pull him through the gaping hole where the nose had been. He braced himself, crawled through the narrow passage to the bomb bay, clipped his parachute harness, and leapt into the air. The slipstream spun him sideways as he pulled the ripcord, the parachute jolting open and the roar of engines fading behind him. Below, the Yugoslav countryside stretched out. Farms, forests, small villages, German patrols. Mispa's final descent was catastrophic. The tail, weakened by stress fractures, separated at 15,000 feet. The forward section slammed into the trees 2 miles away in a column of black smoke. There was no survival. Swanson drifted down, tangled in the parachute, breaking his leg on impact. German soldiers reached him within minutes, carefully lowering him and administering emergency care. Over the next hours, days, and weeks, the surviving crew members were captured and processed, eventually transported to Stalag Luft 4 in Austria. Though imprisoned, they were alive, and that was everything. Swanson's leg healed slowly, months of rehabilitation in a prisoner of war camp under harsh, controlled conditions. Yet despite confinement, they held on to each other, shared memories of that impossible flight, and honored the 2 men who had died instantly in the explosion, Dudley and Henderson. Winter turned to spring, and as the Third Reich collapsed, Swanson and his crew were liberated on April 30, 1945, returning home to the United States after nearly a year in captivity. Evald Swanson went on to live a full life in Michigan, raising a family, quietly carrying the memories of Mispa and her crew. He rarely spoke of that day, calling it simply luck, though history knew better. The crew stayed in touch, honoring the bond formed during those 10 minutes above Budapest, when men and machine teetered on the edge of death and refused to surrender. Mispa's story, the courage of her crew, and the memory of Dudley and Henderson live on because we remember. Because we tell the story. If you feel the weight of their courage, hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more forgotten stories of bravery, and drop a comment to share where you're watching from. Across the world, these stories connect us, reminding us that real heroism doesn't always make headlines, but it never dies.